The first time I noticed my daughter walking into my wife's room after midnight, I told myself it meant nothing, just a daughter checking on her mother before going to bed. But the strange part wasn't that it happened once. It was that it started happening every single night, always after the house had gone completely quiet, always when she thought no one else was awake. At my age, you learn to trust those small feelings that tell you something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. And that feeling kept getting stronger every night I watched her disappear behind that door. I wish I had listened to it sooner. Because weeks later, I would find myself standing in an airport terminal, staring at my phone, unable to breathe, realizing that whatever my daughter had been doing in that room wasn't just strange. It was something so disturbing that within minutes I canceled my flight and made the most terrifying call of my life. The first night I noticed it, I was sitting alone in the living room well past midnight. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching it. The house had gone completely quiet, the kind of silence where even small sounds carry through the walls. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful footsteps. I turned my head just in time to see my daughter standing outside my wife's bedroom door. She paused there for a second, almost like she was listening, then gently turned the handle and slipped inside without turning on the light. The door closed softly behind her. I remember sitting there, staring at that door longer than I meant to, telling myself there was nothing strange about it. Maybe she was just checking on her mother before going to bed. That explanation sounded reasonable enough. But as the minutes passed and the hallway stayed dark and silent, one small detail began to bother me more than it should have, because my daughter had walked into that room like someone who didn't want anyone to see her do it. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. In daylight, it was easier to doubt myself, but doubt doesn't erase what you saw with your own eyes. That night I stayed awake on purpose, determined to confirm whether it was real or just my imagination. When midnight arrived and the house fell silent, I felt my pulse start to rise. Then I heard it again, slow footsteps moving down the hallway, the same direction, the same timing. This time she moved even more carefully, pausing at the corner before approaching the door, as if listening for any sound inside the house. My chest tightened as I watched from the living room, not moving, not breathing. She reached the door, glanced once toward the darkness behind her, and slipped inside. The door closed softly, and in that moment I stopped telling myself it was harmless, because something inside me finally understood this was no longer random. It was intentional. And if it was intentional, then I needed to find out why before it went any further. The third night, I didn't sit in the living room pretending to read. I stood quietly near the hallway, muscles tense, holding my breath as the house settled into silence. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavier this time, and I froze, every nerve alert. She didn't head straight for the bedroom. Instead, she paused near the hallway closet, her fingers brushing along the edge as if hiding or retrieving something small I couldn't yet identify. My chest tightened and a chill ran down my spine. Then she moved again, creeping toward my wife's door, but this time she paused longer, glancing in my direction. I stepped back instinctively, barely daring to breathe. When she finally slipped inside and closed the door, the silence returned, but the tension didn't. This night had changed everything. She wasn't just following a pattern anymore. And if she knew someone could be watching, then I couldn't stay passive. I needed to find out what she was doing, and soon. After that night, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Something inside me had shifted, because once you start noticing patterns in your own home, you can't unsee them. The next evening, instead of sitting quietly and waiting, I began thinking carefully about what I had actually seen. The way she paused, the way she glanced around, the way her hand moved near the closet before heading toward my wife's room. That detail kept replaying in my mind. If she was hiding something, I needed proof, not assumptions, not fear, but something concrete. I told myself that confronting her without evidence could make things worse, especially if this was something serious. So instead of reacting emotionally, I decided I would observe more closely and look for confirmation. I started paying attention to small details during the day: her behavior, her phone habits, the way she reacted when I asked simple questions about my wife's room. And the more I observed, the more I felt certain that whatever was happening at night was not accidental. It was planned. And if it was planned, then I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that the truth might be far more disturbing than I was ready to accept. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Sitting in the living room, listening as the house grew quiet, I realized that simply watching from the shadows wasn't enough. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation. Maybe she was checking on my wife. Maybe she was hiding something small. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the instinct that had kept me awake nights before wasn't lying. Something was happening behind that door, something deliberate, and I had no proof. That's when the thought hit me. If I wanted to understand what was going on, I couldn't just watch and hope to catch her by chance. I needed a way to see clearly without being seen. The idea made my stomach tighten, because installing a camera felt like crossing a line into suspicion I wasn't sure I could live with. Yet the alternative, doing nothing and wondering what was happening every night, was worse. I spent the rest of the evening planning carefully where I could place it, how to stay unnoticed, and what I might finally discover. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer just observing. I was preparing to uncover a truth that could change everything. Installing the camera felt heavier than I expected, not because it was complicated, but because of what it represented. I kept asking myself whether I was protecting my family or crossing into something I could never undo. Still, the pattern had left me no peace, and by the time the house grew quiet that evening, I had already placed the small device where it could see the hallway and the bedroom door without being obvious. I tested it twice, making sure the angle was correct, my hands slightly trembling as I adjusted it. When everything looked steady, I stepped back and told myself this was only for clarity, nothing more. That night, instead of sitting in the living room like before, I prepared to leave for a short business trip the next morning, which meant I wouldn't be home to observe directly. The thought made me uneasy, but it also meant the camera would finally do the watching for me. As midnight approached, I found myself checking the live feed on my phone, my heart beating faster with every passing minute. The hallway appeared empty at first, quiet and still, and for a brief moment I wondered if the nights had been nothing but my imagination. Then I waited, knowing that if the pattern continued, the camera would capture the truth, and once I saw it, there would be no turning back. The house looked completely normal on the live feed, almost too normal, and that silence made my anxiety worse, because now I wasn't guessing, I was waiting. I kept the phone in my hand as the minutes crawled by, watching the empty hallway glow faintly on the screen. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement. My daughter appeared at the edge of the camera's view, moving slowly down the hallway just like before. But this time, seeing it on a screen felt different, colder, more real, because there was no doubt about what I was watching. She stopped near the closet again, and I leaned closer to the phone without even realizing it, trying to see every detail clearly. For a brief moment, she looked directly toward the area where the camera was placed, and my breath caught in my throat, afraid she might notice it. Instead, she adjusted something near the closet door, something small and dark in her hand, before continuing toward my wife's room. When she slipped inside and closed the door, I remained frozen, staring at the screen, replaying the clip immediately to be certain I hadn't misunderstood what I saw. This time, there was no doubt. The camera had captured everything. And whatever was happening in that room was no longer just suspicion. It was recorded evidence. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until my chest started to ache, so I forced myself to sit down and replay the footage slowly, frame by frame, because I needed to be absolutely sure of what I had seen. The hallway part was clear enough, her walking, pausing, adjusting something near the closet, but what mattered was what happened at the bedroom door. I watched as she entered again, this time staying inside longer than the previous nights. Minutes passed on the recording, and I kept staring at the screen, waiting for something to explain the tension building in my mind. Then, just before the clip ended, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A brief flicker of light coming from inside the room, as if someone had turned on a device or opened something that reflected illumination. It wasn't bright, just a quick flash, but it was enough to confirm that activity was happening inside. My wife had not moved from the bed during that time, at least not in a way I could see from the angle. That realization made my thoughts race. If my daughter was entering the room every night, and there were unexplained movements and light inside, then this was no longer about routine visits. This was about intent. And intent meant I couldn't wait any longer to understand exactly what was happening behind that door. After replaying the footage several times, I sat in complete silence, trying to process what I had just seen. Because once evidence replaces suspicion, everything feels heavier. The flicker of light inside the room kept repeating in my mind, and the longer I thought about it, the more I realized this situation could no longer be handled quietly. If something was being hidden, I couldn't solve it alone by guessing or watching from a distance. My responsibility wasn't just as a husband, it was as someone who needed to make sure my wife was safe. That thought pushed me to consider the possibility that this might be bigger than a family misunderstanding. I checked the recording again, focusing carefully on the moments near the closet and the bedroom door, looking for anything I might have missed. The details were clear enough to make my hands tremble slightly. This wasn't random behavior, it was structured, repeated, intentional. And if it was intentional, then it required outside judgment, not emotion. I realized that if I waited too long, I might regret not acting sooner. For the first time since this began, I understood that I might need to involve someone beyond our home, someone trained to handle situations that felt this serious. And once that thought entered my mind, I knew there was no going back to pretending everything was normal. The more I reviewed the footage, the clearer it became that this wasn't something I could handle with a simple conversation, because every time I tried to imagine confronting her directly, I felt the situation could either explode or disappear without explanation. My wife's safety kept running through my mind, especially the brief light I had seen inside the room, and the way my daughter moved with purpose instead of hesitation. That kind of behavior doesn't happen by accident night after night. It follows intention. And intention, when repeated, starts to feel serious. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, thinking about how quickly things could change if I reacted emotionally instead of carefully. If I accused her without proof, I could destroy trust forever. But if I ignored it and something truly wrong was happening, I would never forgive myself. That balance between caution and responsibility weighed heavily on me, and for the first time I admitted to myself that this might require official guidance. The thought wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Because when uncertainty starts to affect your family's safety, you don't just hope it improves. You take steps to make sure the truth is understood clearly, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The timing couldn't have been worse, because the morning after reviewing the footage, I had to prepare for a business trip that had been scheduled weeks earlier, and suddenly leaving the house felt like the most difficult decision I had ever made. Packing my suitcase, I kept thinking about the camera and whether it would continue recording without interruption, because now that I had proof something unusual was happening, I couldn't afford to miss a single detail. The idea of being far away while those nightly visits continued made my chest tighten, especially knowing I wouldn't be there to see what happened in real time. Before leaving, I checked the camera feed again and made sure the connection was stable, watching the hallway for several minutes just to confirm everything was working properly. The house appeared calm during the day, which only increased my concern, because problems that hide in daylight often reveal themselves at night. As I zipped my suitcase, I felt an unfamiliar sense of urgency building inside me, not panic, but responsibility. If something serious was unfolding, distance would not solve it. And by the time I reached the door to leave, I understood that this trip would test whether the camera was enough, or whether I would soon have to take a much bigger step. By the time I reached the airport, the weight of the situation had settled deep in my thoughts, because now I wasn't just observing from another room in the house. I was about to be miles away, relying entirely on the camera to show me what I couldn't see in person. Sitting at the gate, I quietly checked the live feed again, trying to convince myself everything would remain calm during the day. The hallway looked normal, almost peaceful, and for a few minutes I allowed myself to breathe more slowly. But peace can sometimes be misleading, especially when you know there's a pattern that usually begins after midnight. As boarding time approached, I kept thinking about the nights ahead and whether the visits would continue exactly as before. The uncertainty made it difficult to focus on anything else, and I found myself refreshing the feed repeatedly just to make sure the connection hadn't failed. Every time the screen updated, my attention sharpened instantly. The house was still quiet, but now that I was away, even that silence felt heavier. And as I prepared to board the flight, one thought stayed with me. If anything unusual appeared on that camera while I was in the air, I would have to decide very quickly what to do next. I had barely settled into my seat on the plane when I felt the pull of anxiety stronger than ever. Even as the engines roared to life, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking slightly as I reached for my phone to check the camera feed one last time before takeoff. The hallway appeared dark and quiet at first, but then I froze. There she was, my daughter, standing at the edge of the frame, just as she always had. But this time, something was different. She wasn't moving slowly or quietly. Her movements were deliberate, urgent, and focused. She glanced toward the camera, toward me, and then disappeared behind the bedroom door. My chest tightened and my breath caught as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last because the realization hit me in full. Whatever had been happening these nights, it was escalating, and I wasn't in the house to intervene. My fingers hovered over the screen, every instinct screaming that I needed to act immediately. In that moment, before even leaving the airport, I made a decision I had tried to avoid, but now could no longer postpone. I had to call someone who could handle this, and fast. As soon as I saw her disappear behind that bedroom door on the live feed, I knew I couldn't keep waiting for more proof, because sometimes the moment you understand something is wrong is the moment you're already running out of time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and sitting there in the airport seat, surrounded by travelers preparing for normal flights, I felt completely alone with what I had just witnessed.
I replayed the clip one more time, making sure I hadn't misunderstood her movements or the direction she was looking, and each replay only strengthened my concern. This wasn't confusion anymore, it was escalation. I thought about my wife at home, about the repeated nightly visits, about the small but consistent signs that something intentional was happening. And in that quiet space between boarding announcements, I accepted that this was no longer a family matter I could resolve privately. If there was even a chance that someone's safety was involved, I had to act responsibly. With my hands still trembling, I searched for the right number, took a slow breath, and decided that whatever consequences followed, I would rather face them knowing I had tried to protect my family than live with regret. That was the moment I understood there was no turning back, because once you involve authorities, the truth doesn't stay hidden for long. After I made the call, everything around me felt strangely distant, as if the airport noise had faded into the background, and I was the only person still standing inside my own thoughts. I explained carefully what I had seen on the camera, the repeated nighttime visits, the movement near the closet, the light inside the room, and I tried to stay calm so my voice would not shake. The person on the other end asked me detailed questions, and each question made me realize how serious this was becoming, because they were no longer treating it like a simple misunderstanding. They wanted timestamps. They wanted confirmation about the camera angle. They wanted to know exactly what I observed. As I answered, I felt both relieved and anxious. Relieved that someone was listening, but anxious because this meant the situation had crossed into official attention. When the call ended, I sat back in my seat and stared at my phone screen, waiting for further instructions. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, but I barely heard them. My focus was locked on the fact that help might already be in motion. And now, for the first time since this began, I wasn't just watching events unfold. I had set something larger into action, and I had no idea how quickly it would reach my home. When the call ended, I sat back in my seat and stared at my phone screen, waiting for further instructions. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, but I barely heard them. My focus was locked on the fact that help might already be in motion. And now, for the first time since this began, I wasn't just watching events unfold. I had set something larger into action, and I had no idea how quickly it would reach my home. I was still sitting in the terminal, trying to steady my breathing, when my phone vibrated again, and for a brief second I thought it might be a simple follow-up question, but it wasn't. The call was from the same number, and when I answered, the tone had changed. They told me they had reviewed the details I provided and wanted me to remain calm while they verified a few things from their side. That sentence alone made my stomach tighten, because it meant the situation was serious enough for immediate review. While we were speaking, I opened the camera feed again out of habit, almost afraid to look, but also unable not to. The hallway was empty, yet something felt different in the atmosphere of the recording. Then I noticed it. The camera angle had shifted slightly. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to make me realize someone inside the house might have touched or adjusted something near the hallway area. That small change sent a wave of urgency through me. If the device had been noticed, then the risk had increased. I quickly informed them about the angle shift, and the conversation grew more focused after that. At that moment, I understood clearly. This was no longer just observation. It had become an active situation, and time was now a critical factor. While I was still on the phone, trying to explain the slight change in the camera angle, something on the live feed caught my eye that made my entire body go still. The hallway was quiet, but this time I noticed movement that didn't match the usual pattern. My daughter appeared in the frame earlier than expected, not after midnight like before, but while the house was still partially active. She moved quickly toward the hallway area, looking around with clear awareness, and for the first time, I felt certain she understood something was different. That realization changed everything, because if she suspected monitoring, then the situation had shifted from secrecy to awareness. I told the person on the phone what I was seeing in real time, and their tone became even more serious as they asked me to stay on the line. My heart was pounding as I watched her pause near the hallway, glance around once more, and then disappear out of the camera's view. The feed remained steady, but my confidence didn't. Now there was no doubt. Whatever was happening inside that house was escalating, and I was no longer simply a concerned husband watching from a distance. I was someone connected to an unfolding situation, and the next few minutes would determine how quickly things moved from suspicion to intervention. As I described the real-time movement on the phone, the response I received was calm but firm, and that tone told me everything I needed to know about how serious this had become. They asked me not to disconnect, but to stay available while they coordinated next steps, and that simple instruction made the situation feel very real. I kept watching the live feed, my eyes locked on the hallway, waiting for any sign of movement again. The house appeared quiet, but now silence felt different, heavier, almost controlled. I realized that if my daughter truly suspected something, she might alter her behavior, and that meant the pattern I had been relying on could change at any moment. That thought increased my urgency because evidence is strongest when behavior is predictable and weakest when it suddenly shifts. I refreshed the feed repeatedly, making sure the connection remained stable, and confirmed that the recording was still running. Every second felt important now. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about timing. If authorities were going to understand the full picture, the next movements inside that house would matter more than ever. And as I sat there in the airport, fully aware that events at home were unfolding without me, I understood that the situation had reached a point where immediate action might be required. While I was still on the line, watching the feed and answering questions, something inside me shifted. Not panic, but clarity. I realized that waiting for the situation to resolve on its own was no longer an option, because every new detail had only confirmed that this was structured behavior, not coincidence. The repeated visits, the cautious movements, the brief changes in timing, all of it formed a pattern that could not be ignored. I told myself that whatever was happening would eventually surface, but I also understood that some situations require more than observation. They require decisive action. As I sat in the airport chair, I felt the weight of responsibility more strongly than fear. If something serious was occurring inside that room, then every minute mattered. I informed them that I was prepared to cooperate fully and provide any additional recordings they needed. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was thinking strategically. The mystery had evolved into a matter that demanded proper handling, and I could feel the next stage approaching quickly. Whatever was unfolding at home, it was no longer isolated. It was in motion, and now so were the people trained to deal with it. As the conversation continued, I kept one eye on the live feed and one ear on the instructions I was receiving, and that combination made it impossible to think about anything else. The house still appeared quiet, but now silence felt temporary, like something waiting to happen. I refreshed the camera again and confirmed the recording was saved, because protecting evidence suddenly felt just as important as discovering it. That realization changed my mindset completely. This wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about ensuring clarity, accuracy, and safety. I began to understand that if intervention was needed, the timing would be critical, and any delay could complicate the situation. Sitting there in the airport, surrounded by people focused on their own travel plans, I felt like I was in a different reality, one where every movement inside my home mattered. I checked the battery level of the device remotely, making sure nothing would interrupt the feed. The stakes had quietly risen, and I could sense that whatever happened next would determine how this situation ended. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether something was wrong. I was preparing for the possibility that it was far more serious than I had initially imagined. I was about to lower my phone when the hallway on the screen suddenly changed, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that made my attention snap back instantly. The camera view showed movement again, but this time it wasn't just my daughter walking normally down the hall. She was carrying something more visible, held close to her body, and moving with a sense of urgency that I hadn't seen before. My breathing slowed without me realizing it because I needed to focus completely on what was happening. She paused near the hallway closet, glanced around carefully, and then opened it briefly, as if checking or adjusting whatever had been inside earlier. That moment confirmed something important. The closet was not random. It was part of the pattern. I immediately informed the person on the call about what I was seeing, describing every detail as precisely as possible. They asked me to continue watching without interfering, and that instruction made the situation feel even more serious. The hallway remained quiet, but now the behavior on screen had evolved, and that evolution meant the story was no longer repeating itself, it was progressing. And as I stared at the live feed, I understood that whatever was being hidden in that house was moving closer to being revealed. As I watched the live feed and listened to the ongoing instructions, something inside me shifted from concern to full awareness, because the movements on screen were no longer subtle, they were deliberate. My daughter appeared again in the hallway, but this time she moved with visible urgency, as if responding to something I couldn't yet understand. She didn't pause near the closet for long. Instead, she adjusted something quickly and then looked directly toward the direction of the camera's placement. That brief glance made my pulse spike because it felt intentional, not accidental. I immediately leaned closer to the phone, studying every detail, trying to determine whether she had noticed the device. The atmosphere inside the house seemed to tighten in the recording, and even though there was no sound, the visual tension alone was enough to raise alarm. I relayed everything carefully, explaining the change in behavior, the earlier camera shift, and the possibility that she might be aware of surveillance. The response I received confirmed that this situation required careful handling and coordination. Sitting in the airport with boarding announcements echoing in the background, I realized that events at home were advancing quickly, and the difference between observation and intervention was becoming smaller by the minute. Whatever was happening inside that room was no longer hidden in routine, it was accelerating. The longer I watched the feed, the clearer it became that staying on the flight would be a mistake, because every new movement inside the house felt like it could change the situation within seconds. I looked at the boarding gate, then back at my phone, and realized I wouldn't be able to focus on anything else while this was unfolding. The instructions I had received earlier suddenly felt even more important, and I understood that if authorities needed cooperation, I had to be fully available. With my heart still racing, I stepped away from the gate area and moved toward a quieter corner of the terminal so I could speak clearly without interruption. As I explained the latest developments, the shifting behavior, the possible awareness of the camera, and the increasing urgency, the tone of the conversation reflected how seriously this had escalated. I felt a mix of responsibility and determination, because now my role was not just to observe, but to support the process unfolding. The thought of being away from home no longer felt practical, it felt risky. And as I stood there, looking at the live feed one more time, I knew that whatever happened next would require me to be ready for immediate action. Almost immediately after I finished explaining the latest developments, the voice on the other end became firmer. "You need to get back home. Do not board the flight. Return immediately," they said. And in that moment, the weight of everything hit me fully. My hands tightened around the phone, and I could feel my chest constrict as I realized the situation was now moving faster than I could have anticipated. The hallway on the camera still appeared quiet, but knowing what I had already seen made the silence feel charged, like a pause before something inevitable. I quickly canceled my boarding, grabbed my suitcase, and tried to arrange transport as efficiently as possible, all the while keeping my eyes on the feed. Every second mattered, and I knew that the longer I was away, the higher the risk that whatever was happening would escalate further. My mind raced through the possibilities, the unknowns, and the consequences, but there was no time for hesitation. I needed to be home, not just to observe anymore, but to take part in the next step, whatever that might be. The urgency in the voice on the line left no doubt. The situation was now beyond me, and immediate action was the only choice. The drive back felt longer than it should have, even though I knew every mile was bringing me closer to the truth. I kept checking the live feed as often as it was safe to do so, watching the hallway carefully, noticing every small change in lighting and movement. The house appeared calm during the daytime, which only increased my concern, because calm after repeated nighttime activity doesn't feel natural, it feels temporary. When I finally reached the neighborhood, my heart began beating faster, not out of fear alone, but out of anticipation. I parked a little farther down the street so I wouldn't draw attention, then stepped out and took a slow breath before approaching the house. From outside, everything looked ordinary, almost reassuring, but I knew appearances could be misleading. Before entering, I checked the camera feed one more time to confirm it was still recording properly. The hallway was visible, quiet, unchanged, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. Standing at my own front door, I realized this was no longer about watching from a distance. I was now back in the center of it, and whatever had been happening inside that room would soon have to face reality. Standing outside my own home, I realized that hesitation would only delay the truth. So I slowly unlocked the door and stepped inside, trying to keep my movements calm and controlled. The house felt different now that I was physically present again, not because anything looked unusual in daylight, but because I knew what had been happening at night. As I walked down the hallway, I felt my awareness sharpen with every step, listening carefully for any sound coming from my wife's room. The door was closed, and from the outside, everything seemed normal, but the memory of the repeated nighttime visits made my pulse rise. I paused for a moment, placing my hand near the door handle, reminding myself that I needed to handle this carefully. If something serious was occurring, rushing in emotionally could make it worse. I took one slow breath, thinking about the recordings, the instructions I had received, and the responsibility I now felt. This was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was about clarity. With steady determination, I prepared to finally confront the situation directly, knowing that whatever I discovered behind that door would confirm whether my fears were justified or completely misplaced. I slowly pushed the bedroom door open, expecting my heart to explode in my chest, but what I saw inside made me freeze completely. The room was quiet, softly lit by the afternoon light coming through the curtains, and for a split second, nothing looked unusual. My wife was resting on the bed, looking calm, and my daughter was standing near the side table, not acting secretive, not startled, just focused on something in her hands. The tension I had been carrying for days surged instantly, because now I was face to face with the very scene I had been watching on camera. My daughter looked up at me, her expression serious but not panicked, and that alone confused me more than anything. I glanced quickly toward the closet area, remembering the repeated movements I had seen there, but nothing seemed disturbed from this angle. The silence in the room felt heavy, not because something was obviously wrong, but because I couldn't immediately understand what was happening. For the first time since this began, I was standing inside the situation instead of watching it remotely, and that made every detail feel more intense. Whatever explanation existed, it was about to be revealed directly, and I realized I needed to listen carefully before making any assumptions.
I kept my voice steady as I asked my daughter what was happening, because I knew that the way I approached this moment would determine everything that followed. She didn't react with fear or anger. Instead, she looked at me with a calm expression that didn't match the tension I had been carrying for days. That calmness unsettled me more than panic would have. She gently placed the item she had been holding onto the table and stepped slightly closer to me, speaking in a low voice so my wife wouldn't be disturbed. As she began explaining, I realized that I had been interpreting the nightly visits through fear rather than facts, and now I needed to listen carefully. She described a situation that required privacy and consistency, something she believed was necessary to help my wife during the night. And her explanation slowly started filling in gaps I hadn't understood before. I found myself replaying the camera footage in my mind, comparing what I saw with what I was hearing, and noticing that certain details now made more sense in context. The closet movements, the light inside the room, the timing, each element was starting to align with a different interpretation than the one I had assumed. For the first time since this began, the story inside that house was no longer built on suspicion alone. It was becoming clearer, and clarity was changing everything. As my daughter continued speaking, I forced myself to listen without interrupting, because I understood that assumptions had carried this situation far enough, and now only facts could move it forward. She explained that the repeated visits were not about secrecy, but about assisting my wife during the night in a very specific way that required consistency and quiet attention. The item she had been carrying was not something harmful, but something related to monitoring and support, used to keep track of my wife's condition while I was away or asleep. Slowly, the details began to connect with what I had seen on the camera. The light inside the room, the movement near the closet, the careful timing. What had looked suspicious from a distance now had context when viewed up close. I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment at how quickly fear had shaped my interpretation. My wife remained calm on the bed, unaware of the full tension that had built up outside the room, and that realization made me pause. The situation that had pushed me to call for urgent help was beginning to look very different in the presence of direct communication. For the first time since installing the camera, I understood that truth requires more than footage. It requires conversation, and sometimes the courage to ask before assuming. And as the weight in my chest slowly eased, I realized that the story was not ending in disaster, but in understanding. Even as the explanation settled in, I realized something important. I had already escalated the situation beyond our home. The call I made from the airport wasn't something that could simply be erased, and I felt the responsibility of that decision more clearly now. Authorities had been informed based on what I believed was urgent evidence, and that meant the next steps were no longer entirely in my control. Standing there in the bedroom, listening to my daughter's calm explanation, I understood that situations can look completely different depending on perspective, timing, and communication. The camera footage had captured movement, but it hadn't captured context. Now, inside the room, details that once seemed alarming were aligning with a more practical explanation. Still, I knew that once a report is initiated, the process must follow its course to ensure everything is verified properly. I felt a mixture of relief that nothing harmful appeared to be happening and concern that my reaction had triggered a formal response.
The house was quiet again, but the emotional intensity remained high, because decisions made in moments of fear can create consequences that last longer than the fear itself. And now the focus shifted from suspicion to clarification, making sure everyone involved understood the full picture clearly and responsibly.
A short time later, I received a follow-up call, and this time the tone was measured, focused, and professional, as they informed me that they would review the situation carefully before taking any further steps. I explained that I was now physically inside the house and that the immediate tension had reduced after speaking directly with my daughter. They asked detailed questions about what I had learned, and I answered calmly, making sure to correct any earlier assumptions with the new context I had just received. As I spoke, I realized how important it is to verify information before drawing conclusions, especially when it involves family members and potential safety concerns. The live camera feed, which had once felt like evidence of danger, now seemed more like a precaution that had escalated too quickly due to uncertainty. There was no sign of immediate threat inside the home, and that observation helped everyone involved reassess the urgency level appropriately. I felt a deep sense of responsibility for initiating the response, but also relief that the situation could now be evaluated with clearer understanding. The focus shifted from alarm to verification, ensuring that every detail was accurately reviewed so that no one would remain confused about what had truly been happening. As I spoke, I realized how important it is to verify information before drawing conclusions, especially when it involves family members and potential safety concerns. The live camera feed, which had once felt like evidence of danger, now seemed more like a precaution that had escalated too quickly due to uncertainty. There was no sign of immediate threat inside the home, and that observation helped everyone involved reassess the urgency level appropriately. I felt a deep sense of responsibility for initiating the response, but also relief that the situation could now be evaluated with clearer understanding. The focus shifted from alarm to verification, ensuring that every detail was accurately reviewed so that no one would remain confused about what had truly been happening.
As the situation settled, I began to understand that calling for emergency-level help based on incomplete interpretation had consequences of its own, and that realization weighed on me more than the original fear ever did. Even though everything inside the house now appeared calm and explainable, the fact remained that I had escalated the matter externally, and that process would require follow-up verification. I spoke again with my daughter, this time listening carefully without interrupting, and I made sure to fully understand her perspective and intentions. The more we talked, the clearer it became that the nightly routine had been misread through distance and anxiety, and that communication could have prevented the escalation entirely. My wife, still resting peacefully, remained unaware of how intense the past few days had been, which reminded me how quickly assumptions can grow when information is limited. I felt a mix of relief that there was no immediate danger and humility about how fear had influenced my decisions. The experience taught me that even in your own home, it is essential to confirm facts directly before turning uncertainty into action. As I stood there in the quiet room, I understood that the story was no longer about suspicion. It was about responsibility, awareness, and the importance of understanding before reacting.
After everything had been explained and reviewed, the house felt quieter in a different way. Not the tense silence of suspicion, but the calmer silence that follows a difficult conversation. Still, I couldn't fully relax because once authorities are contacted, even if the situation softens, the process of verification continues until everything is officially confirmed. I stayed attentive to every detail, making sure the camera recordings were preserved properly and that no information was lost. My focus shifted from fear to responsibility, ensuring that any earlier concerns were clearly documented and communicated accurately.
The emotional intensity of the past days began to settle, replaced by reflection about how quickly uncertainty can grow when communication is missing. Standing in the hallway, I realized how important it is to address concerns directly before they develop into larger assumptions. The experience had moved from suspense to understanding, and now the priority was ensuring clarity, transparency, and calm resolution for everyone involved. As the evening approached, I felt a steady sense of relief, knowing that the matter was being handled thoughtfully and that the home was returning to normal routine. As the hours passed and no new concerns emerged, I began to reflect deeply on how quickly fear can grow when we rely on incomplete information, especially in the quiet hours of the night when imagination feels louder than logic. The repeated movements I had seen, the light inside the room, the closet adjustments, each detail had seemed alarming in isolation, but together they reminded me how important context truly is. I realized that protecting my family meant more than reacting to unusual behavior. It meant communicating clearly and confirming facts before drawing conclusions. The tension that had built up over several nights slowly transformed into a lesson about patience and understanding. Even though I had acted with the intention of safety, I understood that every decision carries weight, and it is essential to balance urgency with careful evaluation. As I sat with my wife later that evening, I felt grateful that we could speak openly about concerns and clarify misunderstandings without hostility or fear. The house felt peaceful again, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had been addressed responsibly. And in that calm, I recognized that sometimes the most important outcome of a difficult situation is not drama. It is clarity, communication, and trust restored through honest conversation.
Even though the situation had been clarified, the emotional impact didn't disappear instantly. I could still feel the tightness in my chest when I recalled the repeated nightly movements, the subtle pauses, and the sense that something was wrong. For a few hours, I realized, fear can linger longer than facts, especially when it involves the safety of loved ones. I spent time reflecting on how easy it is to let assumptions escalate, and how vital it is to verify reality before taking drastic measures. Speaking with my daughter and wife had provided context, but it also highlighted the trust and communication gaps that can form quietly over years. I understood that sometimes the hardest lessons aren't about danger itself, but about how we perceive it. And while the immediate crisis had passed, the lingering emotional awareness served as a reminder. Vigilance must always be paired with patience, and caring deeply for those you love also means listening carefully before acting. That quiet realization settled over me like the soft light of late evening, a calm yet firm reminder of responsibility and reflection. That night, instead of sitting alone with my thoughts, I chose to have a calm and honest conversation with my daughter and my wife because I realized that silence had allowed my fears to grow larger than they needed to be. We talked openly about the nightly routine, the reason for the movements, and how my perspective from a distance had shaped a different interpretation. Listening carefully, without interrupting, helped me understand details I had missed before, and I could see how context completely changed the meaning of what I had observed. My daughter explained her intentions clearly, and the explanation aligned with the patterns I had seen once it was described in full. I admitted that my reaction had been driven by concern, but also by limited information, and that honesty between us was more important than pride. The conversation wasn't dramatic, it was steady, respectful, and necessary. As we spoke, I felt the atmosphere in the house grow lighter, not because the events had been erased, but because they had been addressed directly. Trust, I realized, isn't weakened by difficult questions. It is strengthened when those questions are answered with openness. And in that quiet room, surrounded by family, I understood that clarity had replaced uncertainty, and understanding had replaced fear. In the days that followed, I noticed something important. The house no longer felt heavy with suspicion. The hallway that once carried tension now felt ordinary again, and even the nighttime silence seemed peaceful instead of threatening. I kept the camera in place for a while longer, not because I expected danger, but because I believed in finishing what I had started responsibly. Watching the recordings during that time felt different, not like searching for proof, but like confirming stability. Each evening passed without unusual movement, and that consistency slowly reassured me that the situation had been misunderstood rather than malicious. I also reflected on how quickly fear can escalate when communication is missing, and how easily assumptions can turn into urgency. Sitting with my family, sharing regular conversations again, I felt the atmosphere return to normal routines. The experience had been intense, but it also strengthened my awareness of how important direct dialogue is within a household. And as the quiet nights continued without incident, I began to accept that sometimes the greatest relief comes not from drama, but from understanding what was truly happening all along.
As the routine settled back into normal life, I found myself thinking about how differently the story could have unfolded if I had reacted purely on emotion instead of gathering information. The camera, which once felt like a tool of suspicion, now served as a reminder of how important it is to verify concerns calmly. I reviewed the recordings one last time, not to search for danger, but to fully understand the sequence of events that had caused such stress. Seeing the footage again with fresh perspective helped me notice details I had overlooked in my anxious state. And those details now made sense within the broader context of our household routines. I realized that perspective can completely change interpretation, especially when distance and timing influence how events are perceived. The experience taught me that in moments of uncertainty, slowing down and communicating directly can prevent unnecessary escalation. As I reflected on everything, I felt grateful that the situation had resolved without harm, and that the conversation we had was open and respectful. What began as fear gradually transformed into a lesson about clarity, patience, and trust, values that matter deeply in any family. Even after everything settled, I couldn't ignore how quickly my mind had filled in the blanks when I didn't have full information. The experience stayed with me, not as fear anymore, but as awareness of how powerful assumptions can be in quiet moments. I thought about how many times in life we see something small and allow it to grow into something larger inside our thoughts, especially when we care deeply about the people involved. This situation reminded me that clarity comes from communication, not distance, and that even the most ordinary household routine can look different depending on perspective. I felt grateful that I had chosen to investigate responsibly rather than ignore my concerns, but I also recognized the importance of balancing vigilance with understanding. The recordings, the calls, and the conversations had all played a role in bringing transparency to the situation. And as the days passed peacefully, I realized that the true resolution wasn't dramatic. It was the return of trust, reinforced through honest dialogue and careful reflection. In the end, what mattered most was not the fear that started the story, but the calm that followed once everything was openly addressed. As the days went on, I found myself replaying the past events in my mind, not with fear, but with curiosity about how I had responded. I realized that my instincts, though protective, had amplified the unknown into something that felt urgent and threatening. Every step I had taken, installing the camera, watching the live feed, calling for help, had been motivated by concern, but also by limited perspective. This reflection was important because it reminded me how easily even experienced adults can misinterpret patterns when context is missing. I began to understand that patience, observation, and communication are equally as critical as vigilance. By reassessing my own reactions, I could see the value of balancing concern with rational thinking. That awareness didn't erase the stress of the experience, but it transformed it into a lesson I could carry forward. The household had returned to calm, but the understanding I gained about my own thought process felt just as important as the clarity we had achieved with my daughter and wife. And in that reflection, I felt a renewed sense of responsibility, not just for safety, but for measured judgment in all areas of life.
With time, the house slowly returned to its usual rhythm, and the nights no longer felt heavy with anticipation. The hallway stayed quiet, the doors remained undisturbed, and the atmosphere felt stable again. I kept the camera in place for a while longer, not because I expected anything unusual, but because reassurance sometimes takes time to fully settle. Each evening passed without incident, and that consistency helped reinforce that the situation had been understood correctly. I continued speaking openly with my family, making sure that communication stayed clear and direct so that no small concern would grow unnoticed in the future. The experience had changed the way I viewed uncertainty, not with fear, but with a more thoughtful approach. Instead of reacting quickly to patterns, I learned to ask questions first and gather complete information before forming conclusions. Life felt calmer, and that calmness carried a sense of maturity with it. The story that once felt intense and urgent now became part of our shared memory, not as a crisis, but as a reminder of how important understanding and conversation truly are within a home. And as the days moved forward peacefully, I felt grateful for the clarity that replaced confusion. Even after everything settled, I noticed that the experience had permanently changed the way I approached uncertainty. I no longer relied solely on first impressions, especially in quiet moments when imagination can easily fill gaps in information. Instead, I reminded myself to slow down, observe carefully, and confirm details before allowing concern to turn into escalation. The situation had taught me that strong emotions can feel convincing, but clarity requires patience and communication. As I reflected on the sequence of events, from the repeated nightly movements to the camera installation and the urgent calls, I could see how each step was driven by responsibility, yet influenced by incomplete understanding. That awareness felt valuable because it strengthened my ability to respond thoughtfully in the future. The household remained peaceful, and the routines continued without interruption, which reinforced that open conversation had resolved the uncertainty. In many ways, the real outcome of this experience wasn't about fear or alarm, it was about growth. And as time passed, I carried that lesson forward, knowing that careful thinking is just as important as protective instincts in maintaining trust and stability within a family. As life returned to its normal rhythm, I began to understand that the most important outcome of everything that happened was not the camera, not the call, and not even the tension itself. It was the way we chose to handle it afterward. The experience had shown me how quickly uncertainty can grow when communication is delayed, and how equally important it is to speak openly before assumptions take control. Sitting together as a family, discussing concerns calmly, strengthened our understanding of one another in a way that silence never could. I realized that trust is not built by avoiding difficult conversations. It is built by having them with patience and respect. The events of those nights became less about suspicion and more about awareness. Awareness of how perception works and how easily context can change meaning. Moving forward, I felt more confident in addressing concerns directly rather than letting them grow in isolation. The house felt lighter, not because problems were ignored, but because they had been discussed clearly and resolved thoughtfully. And in that steady return to everyday life, I understood that calm communication is often the strongest protection a family can have. In the quiet weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about strength in a new way. Because before this experience, I believed strength meant acting quickly and decisively when something felt wrong.
Now I understood that strength also means pausing, listening, and confirming before reacting. That shift in perspective changed how I approached not only family matters, but everyday decisions as well. I noticed that conversations in our home became more open, and small concerns were addressed immediately rather than allowed to build over time. The tension that once filled the hallway had been replaced with simple, honest dialogue. Even the camera, which had once symbolized urgency, became nothing more than a reminder of how careful observation should be balanced with communication. I felt grateful that this experience ended with clarity rather than conflict, and that it strengthened our trust instead of breaking it. Sometimes life presents situations that feel intense in the moment, but with patience and understanding, they transform into valuable lessons. And as I reflected on everything that had unfolded, I realized that true security comes not only from vigilance, but from connection, transparency, and the willingness to talk openly before drawing conclusions. By the time everything felt completely settled, I had gained something more valuable than certainty. I had gained perspective. The experience reminded me that when something unusual appears in your home, it is natural to feel concerned, especially as we grow older and become more protective of the people we love. But it also showed me that concern must be guided by communication and evidence rather than assumptions formed in isolation. Looking back, I could see how each step, from noticing the pattern to installing the camera to making the call, was driven by responsibility. At the same time, I understood that true resolution comes from clarity and conversation. The nights that once felt heavy and uncertain had transformed into a lesson about patience and thoughtful action. Now, when I think about those events, I don't feel fear, I feel awareness. Awareness of how quickly the mind can fill gaps and how important it is to confirm what we see before deciding what it means. And in that realization, I found a deeper sense of confidence in handling future concerns calmly and wisely. With the lessons learned and clarity restored, the house felt lighter than it had in weeks. The once tense nights now carried only calm, and the small creaks of the house were no longer accompanied by worry or suspicion. I continued speaking openly with my daughter and wife, making sure that any minor concerns were addressed immediately, which prevented misunderstandings from growing into larger fears. The camera, still in place, had become a quiet reminder, not of danger, but of the importance of observing with patience and verifying before assuming the worst. I noticed that even small gestures, like checking in with each other at night or sharing details about routines, had an outsized effect on our sense of security. The emotional weight that had once pressed heavily on me was gradually replaced with reassurance. Nights passed peacefully, and the rhythm of normal life returned, stronger than before, fortified by communication, understanding, and the shared awareness that fear loses its grip when approached thoughtfully. In that restored calm, I recognized that sometimes the greatest victories in life come not from dramatic action, but from thoughtful, measured responses. As time continued to pass without incident, I found myself thinking less about what had frightened me and more about what I had learned from the experience. It became clear that situations often appear one way from a distance and another way when examined closely, and that difference can completely change how we respond. I realized how important it is to slow down before making decisions that affect the people we care about, especially when emotions are involved. The experience strengthened my understanding that communication is not just helpful, it is essential. Speaking openly prevents small uncertainties from growing into large misunderstandings. I also learned that technology, like the camera I installed, should be used thoughtfully, not as a replacement for conversation, but as a supportive tool when needed. In the end, what mattered most was not the initial fear, but the willingness to address concerns responsibly and calmly. That approach restored balance in our home and reinforced trust among us. And as I reflected on everything, I felt a deeper appreciation for patience, clarity, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding before reacting.
Looking back now, I don't remember the tension as much as I remember the relief that followed it. The experience became less about fear and more about gratitude. Gratitude that we had the opportunity to talk openly, to clarify misunderstandings, and to strengthen trust rather than allow silence to create distance. I realized how important it is, especially in family life, to check in with one another regularly and not assume that everything is understood without discussion. As we continued our normal routines, the house felt comfortable again, and that comfort carried a deeper meaning than before. It wasn't just the absence of concern, it was the presence of transparency. The nights were calm, the conversations were steady, and the sense of uncertainty gradually faded. I understood that peace is not something that simply returns on its own. It is built through communication, patience, and mutual respect. And in that steady rhythm of everyday life, I felt confident that we had grown stronger together, not because of fear, but because of how we handled it.
In the end, this experience was never just about a camera, a pattern, or a late-night concern. It was about how quickly the mind can turn uncertainty into urgency, and how important it is to balance protection with patience. I learned that even when you feel sure something is wrong, the most responsible step is to gather clear information and communicate directly before making major decisions. The house returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the lesson remained with me. Trust is strengthened through conversation, not silence. As we moved forward, I felt a renewed sense of awareness, not fear. Awareness of how perception works and how easily context can change meaning. And for anyone watching this story, especially as we grow older and become more protective of our loved ones, remember that clarity comes from asking questions, listening carefully, and confirming facts before escalating concerns. Sometimes the most powerful outcome of a tense situation is not drama, but understanding. And in our case, understanding restored calm, strengthened our connection, and reminded me that thoughtful action will always be stronger than reactive fear.